Mosaic, a daily news program from Worldlink TV, presents a selection of news reports from independent and state-controlled broadcasters from throughout the Middle East.
Today, Baghdad was violently bombed. The presidential complex in Baghdad, which includes the presidential palace, was hit by a missile launched from a plane flying on a low altitude.
بصاروخ أطلق من طائرة حلقت على علو منخفض.
Iraq's television broadcasted images of the killed and wounded American soldiers in the city of Nasiriyah, southern Iraq. The U.S. forces had deployed a number of units, armories, and tanks to the Gharaf area and the Holland Bridge in the Shuhada district. There, a battle occurred between the U.S. forces, the Iraqi populist forces, and a few Iraqi tribes. U.S. President George Bush said that U.S. and British forces achieved progress in the war with Iraq. However, he considers all that happened up till now the beginning of a tough battle, adding that anyone who mistreats the prisoners of war will be treated as a war criminal. Meanwhile, Bush expects humanitarian aid to arrive to Iraq within 36 hours. Today, a U.S. military official confirmed the death of 1 out of 13 American soldiers who were wounded during a hand grenade attack in Kuwait. The attack occurred at dawn at the 101st Airborne Division base at the Pennsylvania camp in northern Kuwait. Eyewitnesses reported that 2 tents were under the rubble. Another U.S. officer said that the suspect has been arrested, and he is a soldier from the 101st Airborne Division, adding that initial reports indicate that it was a hand grenade attack.
Last night, the coalition forces bombed the city of Tikrit, killing and injuring Iraqi civilians, also causing material damages.
Last night, 5 Iraqi civilians were killed and another 4 wounded during the bombing of the city of Tikrit, Saddam Hussein's birthplace.
Last night there was a wedding here at the hotel when the raids began. There were losses here. 4 people were martyred and another 4 wounded.
In addition to the civilians who were killed, the city suffers huge damages, including damages to its famous museum, which is one of the most important icons of the city. The Tikrit Hotel is also suffering grave damages. International media went to the area to take live images of the damages caused by the coalition's air raids. The city's buildings were damaged and fires erupted. Ruins are what remains of the buildings, while some pictures are still hanging on the wall. All this destruction is here for the people to see. Additionally, the American and British forces attacked the Iraqi Ba'ath Party headquarters. In the early hours of the morning, Saddam's soldiers and self-sacrificers, under the leadership of Saddam Hussein's son Uday, were deployed to the city. Meanwhile, a number of Tikrit residents rallied in support of the Iraqi president.
Abu Dhabi cameras were at the Yarmouk General Hospital in Baghdad. Injuries to people, including children, vary from stable to critical condition. Iraq's Minister of Health confirmed that most of the injuries were directly caused by bomb shrapnel.
These are the streets of the Amil district in central Baghdad. After a night of intensive air raids, everyone is looking towards the sky as more air raids continued during the daytime. Iraqis got accustomed to the air raids at night, then they would wake up to calm, peaceful days. Then they would wake up to a calm day. However, this time, they are watching the skies, expecting bombs to be dropped at any time. Despite all this, Baghdad's residents did not surrender to fear and resumed their favorite hobbies until the last hour of daylight, before leaving the fields for a larger match. However, neighborhood barricades and streets will continue to be occupied by members of the Ba'ath Party who left their families behind. They are drinking tea the Iraqi way. We will be here. We will stay put, even if they continue to bomb us. We will continue to fight the American enemy planes and missiles with our rifles. Continuous nightly air raids brought back painful memories of the past. Today, teenagers are living some of the same experiences they heard about before, despite the fact that the situation is a lot bigger. We are not afraid of missiles, planes, Bush or Israel. We are ready for the war. How old are you? I'm 17 years old. Abu Hussein is one of millions of Iraqis who lived through past wars. He is calmly walking through the narrow streets of his humble neighborhood. His simple yet big family is waiting for him. They are sitting around the TV waiting to hear official statements and following the latest news of the battlefields. No one in the world can force me out of my home. I will sacrifice all my money, all my children to defend my home. Abu Hussein's family is like all other Iraqi families. They are living this new war, and they sadly remember the painful memories of the past wars, memories that the elders have been carrying around for a long time.
I swear, I don't care. I will stay here, and he can bomb all he wants.
As the night falls, Baghdad's streets become quiet, except for the bustle of the vendors who are preparing to evacuate the area for the police units and the Ba'ath Party resistance fighters, who are on their way to assume their positions for another explosive night. In a few minutes, the curtain will be drawn on the last calm hours of the day here in Baghdad. Then the night will fall, and there will be silence. Only the sounds of sirens and bombings will be heard. Masoud ibn Rabi', Abu Dhabi Television, Baghdad. Dear viewers, these images were broadcasted first by Al Jazeera Network, showing several American POWs captured at the Battle of Al Nasiriyah. U.S. officials admitted that there are 10 missing Americans and that they do not know their fate.
What's your name? From any country? From any country? United States?
Huge explosions were being heard in Baghdad. The Iraqi army shot 2 U.S. warplanes overflying the Iraqi airspace. One of the 2 coalition pilots who ejected over Tigris River in the city center was being detained, while Iraqi troops are still searching in and around the river for the second pilot. Anti-war protesters were out in force on the streets of cities across the Arab world again to vent their anger at the US-led assault on Iraq. In Khartoum, a Sudanese student was fatally wounded by a police bullet when police tried to hold back hundreds of anti-American demonstrators from getting too close to the US embassy over there. Anti-war protesters were out in force on the streets of cities across the Arab world again to vent their anger at the US-led assault on Iraq. More than 20,000 people demonstrated in Egypt, where students from Cairo's Al-Azhar Islamic University burned American, British and Israeli flags and called for Egyptian President Hosni Mubarak to send military support to Iraq. In Gaza City, nearly 10,000 people demonstrated, mostly students from the local Islamic University, carrying Hamas banners and Iraqi flags while chanting their opposition to the US, Britain and their Arab allies. Around 1,000 Syrian and Palestinian students from the Faculty of Letters at Damascus University took to the streets of the Syrian capital, chanting, "We will sacrifice ourselves for you, Baghdad." An anti-war protest outside the British Embassy in Manama also spilled over into clashes with police. 2 people were injured, according to witnesses, as protesters tried to break through a security cordon and hurled 3 homemade petrol bombs towards the embassy garden, one of which started a small fire. They also set fire to a police car. In Oman, students at Sultan Qaboos University in Muscat rallied on campus, and protests were also staged in 2 neighborhoods, including one close to Sib International Airport. In Algeria, the entire country observed a minute's silence as a gesture of solidarity with the Iraqi people at the government's request, while in Tunisia, some 5,000 marched through the capital amid tight security.
The Pentagon, meanwhile, confirmed on Sunday that about 10 US soldiers reported missing in southern Iraq have been taken prisoner and have begun notifying their families. The US acknowledgement, despite earlier denial, came after Iraqi television showed images of dead and captured US soldiers. The Iraqi TV and Al Jazeera channel showed several dead bodies of US soldiers killed in Iraq. They also broadcasted interviews with 5 captured soldiers, including 2 wounded and 1 woman. US Secretary of State Donald Rumsfeld accused Iraq of violating the 4th Geneva Convention by airing those interviews. US media had shown pictures of Iraqi prisoners of war before. Rumsfeld also described the airing as a mere Iraqi propaganda. The US Secretary of Defense added that it would be unfortunate for international news organizations to show the images. General Richard Myers, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff for the US, said that the airing was one more crime by the Iraqi regime, and also asserted that prisoners of war should not be shown on TV. He added that the US has thousands of Iraqi prisoners that are prisoners of war, but showing photographs of them, although over the past few days US media reported that thousands of Iraqis were surrendering and were taken prisoners of war, and the US media showed pictures of them. The northern Iraqi city of Mosul witnessed a new raid after darkness on Sunday after 2 raids earlier in the day. Bomb explosions were heard over the city. Earlier in the morning, sources reported intense bombing on the outskirts of the oil city and to the east in the direction of Kirkuk. They said 4 explosions and air raid sirens echoed from the Mosul area near the front line with Kurdish-held northern Iraq as warplanes overhead were continuing to bomb the region. The sources added that smoke rose from a hill near the town of Faida, controlled by Iraqi President Saddam Hussein's forces, north of the city of Mosul, in what appeared to be airstrikes on Iraqi frontline troops. Mosul was already the target of several coalition bombing raids Saturday and early Sunday. The Kurdistan Democratic Party, the KDP, one of 2 factions which have controlled most of northern Iraq since the aftermath of the 1991 Gulf War, said Saturday that coalition bombing hit an Iraqi presidential palace in Mosul, as well as the main airbase in the oil city of Kirkuk. Kirkuk is strategically valuable to any effort to capture northern Iraq, since the US has been forced to abandon plans to send the 4th Infantry Division into the area through Turkey after that country denied its permission. British troops came up against determined Iraqi resistance Sunday around the strategic port city of Al-Basra, the southern port of Al-Basra, but by nightfall had secured positions on the outskirts of the city. Britain's 7th Armoured Brigade, the famed Desert Rats, were hit with rocket-propelled grenades, artillery, mortars and machine guns mounted from the back of pickup trucks as they advanced on Iraq's second-largest city. U.S. Marines, who had been leading the assault until earlier Sunday, have now withdrawn, moving northwards towards central Iraq and Baghdad and leaving the seizure of al-Basra to be completed by the Desert Rats. Iraq's Information Minister Mohammed Saeed al-Sahaf said that 77 civilians had been killed and 366 others injured by U.S. airstrikes on al-Basra.
Prime Minister Ali Abu Raghib said His Majesty King Abdullah will lead intensive Jordanian diplomatic efforts in the next few days to seek an end to the war on Iraq. The Prime Minister made the remarks at a news conference in Amman, which was also attended by Information Minister Mohammed Al-Adwan and Foreign Minister Marwan Al-Muashir.
Jordan will, in the next few days, will start its diplomatic effort in this direction, in cooperation with our Arab brothers in the Arab countries and our friends in the world, to find an amicable solution that can bring this war to a halt.
Abu Raghib told reporters that Jordan has asked 3 Iraqi diplomats to leave the country because they carried out activities incompatible with their status. He said Jordan's stance was explained to the Iraqi ambassador and expressed hope that the Iraqi government would understand the case. The Prime Minister added that the expulsion of the diplomats was an independent Jordanian decision and was not taken as a result of external pressure.
Those diplomats, they made some activities that were beyond the diplomatic role in Jordan, and they violated the security agreement between Jordan and Iraq. It is a Jordanian-Iraqi issue. We should not give it more dimension than its size. It has nothing to do with any indications from any country.
Abu Raghib categorically denied that any U.S. troops crossed into Iraq through Jordanian territories, reiterating that Jordan will not take sides in the ongoing war on Iraq.
There's so many activities, as I said, for the American forces coming from everywhere, but not from Jordan. Now, sometimes the Iraqis, they state that it is from the west of Iraq, close to the Jordanian borders, but does it mean that it's coming from Jordan? I can confirm that no activity took place from Jordan against Iraq.
Iraqi troops pinned down U.S. and British forces in several places, but the invaders said they would not be deflected from driving onto Baghdad. Iraq showed the bodies of U.S. soldiers killed and some prisoners of war on television. Washington confirmed some U.S. soldiers and an aircraft were believed missing. Iraq said it would respect the Geneva Convention guaranteeing humane treatment of prisoners. An Iraqi minister said Iraqi forces destroyed 10 tanks, 20 armored personnel carriers in the south of the country. U.S. President George W. Bush said there had been progress in the war on Iraq, but warned that it was the start of a tough fight.
I do know that we expect them to be treated humanely, just like we'll treat any prisoners of theirs that we capture humanely. It's important for the American people to realize that this war has just begun.
Tens of thousands took to the streets in Asia, Europe, and the Arab world, voicing strong opposition to the war on Iraq. Newspaper polls suggested support for war was growing in the United States and Britain. Here's more. The world continues to shout no to this illegitimate attack on Iraq. Continent, thousands took to the streets. In South America, thousands of anti-war demonstrators clashed with police in Mexico City after protesters began throwing rocks at the U.S. Embassy. The march culminated outside the U.S. Embassy, where demonstrators chanted "Assassins" and "No to war, yes to peace," when a group among the protesters began shaking security fences surrounding the building. In Europe, hundreds of anti-war protesters clashed with riot police in Madrid on the second day of a series of mass protests. Police fired rubber bullets and used batons to disperse the crowd. According to Spanish police, around 100,000 people marched in Madrid, asking for an end to war and the resignation of pro-U.S. Prime Minister José María Aznar. In Asia, tens of thousands of protesters gathered in the eastern Pakistani city of Lahore in a demonstration called by right-wing religious parties to protest the U.S.-led war against Iraq. A crowd of more than 50,000 torched effigies of U.S. President George W. Bush and denounced what it called American terrorism. Police in riot gear stood guard as activists wielded long sticks and batons to quickly shepherd the people away from the makeshift stage. And here in Amman, several hundred young men and women of different nationalities raised placards and banners calling for a stop to the attack on Iraq and lit candles. Artists also took part in the protest, using their art to condemn the ongoing war. And in Australia, protesters turned out to the Parliament House in Canberra, with thousands marching with their anti-war messages to the Prime Minister John Howard. But the Prime Minister seemed unmoved by the demonstrations, as the leaders of powerful nations also remained unmoved. Turkish Foreign Minister Abdullah Gül has said cooperation between the United States and Turkey is continuing. Within that framework, he said, Turkey opened its Incirlik air base to a C-130 flight for an emergency landing last night. After a meeting with the U.S. Ambassador to Turkey, Robert Pearson, the minister said Ankara understood the United States' sensitivity on the presence of Turkish troops in northern Iraq, but added that Turkey could decide whether to enter northern Iraq or not. Asked if Turkey would allow U.S. planes to land in Turkey within the framework of the motion voted on in the Turkish parliament, Gül said the humanitarian cooperation would continue. U.S. officials say the United States has scrapped plans to move American troops through Turkey into northern Iraq and instead will send the 4th Infantry Division from Texas to Kuwait to join a thrust into Iraq from the south. As Gül spoke, around 1,000 people demonstrated in Istanbul against the war in Iraq. The group walked to the U.S. consulate where riot police intervened. The police used gas bombs to disperse the group. Some of the protesters were arrested. And Arab foreign ministers meet in Cairo tomorrow to seek ways to end the U.S.-led war on Iraq and forge a unified anti-war position. Arab League spokesman Hisham Youssef said the ministers would discuss a diplomatic initiative to try to stop the conflict through the United Nations. The meeting has been scheduled since before the war began, but the start of the conflict has given it greater urgency. Iraqi Foreign Minister Naji Sabri arrived in Cairo from Damascus, where he held talks with his Syrian counterpart Farouk al-Shara. Sabri told reporters upon his arrival that Baghdad wanted the Arab governments to condemn the U.S.-British attacks and call on the attackers to stop the war immediately. Meanwhile, Pope John Paul, who has emerged in recent weeks as one of the most powerful anti-war voices, has prayed for victims of the Iraq War and their families. Speaking to tens of thousands of people in St. Peter's Square in Rome, the Pope prayed for help to bring about peace. Yesterday, the Pope said that the war on Iraq threatened humanity's fate. In Berlin, German Foreign Minister Joschka Fischer criticized the United States for starting a war framed by its national interests. He said the same standards should apply for all nations, regardless of their size or might. Fischer repeated that the United Nations should be the place to resolve conflicts. 4 Jordanian students have been killed in a tragic accident near the northern Iraqi city of Mosul last night as they were on their way home by land. Authorities were holding contacts to determine the cause of the accident. The Foreign Ministry is also making arrangements to bring the bodies home. The 4 students were identified as Sufyan al-Batayne, Abdullah Ababne, Ahmed al-Ainzi, and Umran al-Shrihin. Japanese Foreign Minister Yurikiro Kawaguchi has telephoned her counterpart Marwan Lemashar, pledging $1 million in aid to Jordan. The aid money is to be given to the kingdom as the country's economy will suffer most from the war on Iraq, The two foreign ministers also discussed over the phone the latest developments in Iraq and Jordanian-Japanese ties.
Minister of Local Government Dr. Saeb Arakat accused Israel today of trying to destroy the roadmap to a Palestinian state by proposing to extend a fence guarding its territory 20 kilometers further into the West Bank. An Israeli official speaking on condition of anonymity said earlier in Jerusalem that the security fence could be shifted 20 kilometers eastward to protect the Ariel and Kadumim settlements in the northern West Bank. Dr. Arakat accused the Prime Minister Ariel Sharon's government of thinking it can use the fact that the world's eyes are turned to Iraq to create a new situation on the ground. The Israelis want to destroy the roadmap to a Palestinian state and replace it with an Israeli roadmap by imposing a new reality on the ground with settlements and occupation, Dr. Arakat said. Dr. Arakat called the fence plan a great challenge for the quartet dealing with the Middle East peace process. The Israeli fence proposal is going to show whether the quartet is serious. We are asking them to prevent Israel from putting the fence plan into place, Arakat said. Israeli occupation forces continued its raising to the citizens' properties east of Gaza, where they demolished an under-construction home, a concrete factory, in addition to raising wide agricultural areas. Israeli occupation forces stormed today Al-Bayuk areas north of Rafah Governorate amid intensive shooting toward the citizens' homes, causing at least 2 injuries and arrested a number of citizens. Israeli occupation forces raided today Jenin city completely and imposed curfew. Witnesses reported that more than 35 armored vehicles stormed the city under intensive fire, backed by Apache helicopters. In the meantime, Israeli forces carried out an incursion into Yamoun and Seilat al-Harthiyah villages and ransacked the homes, commercial shops, bakeries, water store, and street lights. Israeli Prime Minister Ariel Sharon called on the population to remain vigilant on the 4th day of the U.S. military offensive against Iraq. The possibility of a non-conventional Iraqi attack against Israel is not ruled out. We should remain vigilant because he could want to hit Israel with one or several chemical or biological warheads, said Major General Amos Gilad. Gilad explained that western Iraq, which is the only part of the country from which missiles could reach Israel's state, was not yet under Allied control. The foreign ministers of Russia and India warned today that the U.S. bombardment in Iraq could lead to a humanitarian and ecological catastrophe in the region. The Russian Foreign Ministry said in a statement after phone talks between Russia's Igor Ivanov and India's Yashwant Sinha. The international community cannot allow this. Russia and India want the regulation of the Iraqi problem brought back to the Security Council, and they strongly call for this, the statement said. The two foreign ministers expressed their profound concern over Iraq's operations undertaken against Iraq by the United States and Britain bypassing the UN Security Council, it said. United States and Turkish diplomats and military personnel sought in Ankara today to find the basis for an agreement in principle to allow Turkish troops to intervene in the Kurdish-held northern Iraq, Anatolia news agency said. Turkey denied Saturday sending forces into northern Iraq, but insisted its army was ready to intervene in the Kurdish-held enclave there, despite opposition from the United States and European allies. The US and Turkey last month negotiated an accord on military cooperation, but this was abandoned after Turkey's parliament rejected proposals to allow 62,000 United States troops to deploy on Turkish soil toward the border with Iraq.
Mosaic is made possible by a grant from the John S. and James L. Knight Foundation, which promotes journalism excellence worldwide and invests in the vitality of 26 U.S. communities, and the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation. Additional support provided by Henry and Virgilia Dakin.